In the highlands of West Java, where morning mist clings to the slopes and bamboo groves sway with a creaking rhythm, there is a hill that looks no different from any other. Yet, upon closer inspection, its lines betray a strange precision. Terraces stacked in neat succession, basalt columns standing upright as if positioned by an unseen architect thousands of years ago. This is Gunung Padang. From afar, it appears as a gentle green rise among rice terraces and sleeping volcanoes. But once you step onto it, the feeling changes. Hexagonal basalt stones are set in deliberate rows, as though some ancient hand had carried them here from a distant place. Walking on each step, you can sense a faint vibration beneath your feet. Not a sound, but a subtle pulse, a quiet breath from the earth itself. Why do these stones sing? And why are they here at all? To the people of Karyamukti, Gunung Padang is the mountain of enlightenment, a sacred place woven into oral tradition. They tell of King Siliwangi, who tried to build a palace in a single night with the aid of supernatural forces, only for the work to remain unfinished by dawn. The tale sounds like legend, yet it feels like an echo of something older, a hint that someone, or something, once sought to leave an enduring mark on this hill. Archaeologists surveying its surface have dated the visible terraces to only a few thousand years ago. But recent geophysical studies revealed something far more unsettling. Beneath the soil and vegetation lie multiple layers of construction, each older than the one above. The deepest layer may date back 25,000 to 28,000 years, a time when, according to conventional history, the people here were scattered bands of hunter-gatherers. If this is true, Gunung Padang is not a mere hill. It is a massive stepped structure older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by tens of thousands of years. So who built it, and why? One theory imagines it as an astronomical observatory where Ice Age peoples tracked the movements of the heavens. Another suggests it was a kind of ancient energy hub, harnessing the Earth's magnetic field and the resonant qualities of the stone for rituals or technology unknown to us. Others see it as a refuge, a high ground built to survive a catastrophic flood, much like the one described in the Bible's account of Noah's Ark. The clues only deepen the mystery. The stones appear not only deliberately placed, but also tuned, resonating at frequencies close to ancient musical scales. Could these giant instruments have been used in ceremonies to communicate with the divine? Or perhaps to move heavy stones without wheels or beasts of burden? At sunset, golden light sweeps across the terraces, highlighting sharp lines and uncanny right angles. It is easy to picture ancient processions ascending step by step, bearing offerings under a canopy of stars. And it is just as easy to imagine ships of survivors, like Noah's in Genesis, searching for high land as floodwaters consume the world. Scientists remain cautious, insisting that any claims must be backed by solid evidence. But Gunung Padang stands firm, silent and unmoving, challenging the limits of human history. Conversations about it echo not only in academic halls, but in bustling markets, quiet cafes, and online forums, where tales of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and lost continents spread without restraint. Perhaps it is the work of a civilization erased from memory, leaving only stones that still hum beneath our feet. Or perhaps it is nothing more than nature's elaborate illusion, a geological trick that happens to resemble the work of human hands. Yet the questions remain, and will remain for centuries. If this truly is a 28,000-year-old pyramid, how would it rewrite the story of humanity? And if it is not, why does it so stubbornly resemble a message from the past? In the soft haze of evening, Gunung Padang continues to guard its secrets. Beneath layers of earth, the stones still hum with the deep rhythm of time, waiting for someone patient and brave enough to listen. Long before ground-penetrating radar traced hidden chambers beneath Gunung Padang, its story traveled only by breath and memory. In the mist-shrouded evenings of West Java, when the last light fades over the paddies and the hills turn to silhouettes, elders would gather under the eaves of bamboo homes to speak of the mountain. The way they told it, the stones were not dead things. They were witnesses. Each one, they claimed, had stood in place since the age when gods and men walked the same paths. The name itself, Gunung Padang, is simple: mountain of the field. But in the Sundanese tongue, the word Padang can also carry the weight of illumination, enlightenment, even revelation. To those who live within sight of it, the hill is not just a landmark. It is a meeting point between the earthly and the divine. Folklore says the terraces were once polished smooth, glinting in moonlight like silver scales, a staircase for kings or angels. One tale lingers above the rest: the saga of King Siliwangi. He is remembered as both warrior and mystic, a figure whose footprints still echo in the cultural landscape of Java. In the story, Siliwangi set out to build a palace in a single night, calling upon spirits and unseen forces to lend their strength. All through the hours of darkness, stones rose into place as if weightless, the air trembling with the sound of unseen hands at work. Yet when dawn broke, the work stood incomplete, whether by the interference of jealous spirits or by the will of heaven itself. No one can say. To modern ears, it may sound like nothing more than a bedtime legend. But to the people of Karyamukti, the story is not metaphor. It is record. In their telling, the palace may have been something far older, far stranger, built not for the rule of men, but for the purposes of eternity. They point to flood stories, not unlike the great flood in Genesis, in which survivors sought the highest ground as the oceans swallowed the plains. In these accounts, Gunung Padang was a refuge, a place built to withstand both water and time. What is striking is how these local myths mirror others half a world away. The notion of a high place preserved from a great inundation appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Aztec tale of Cox Cox, and in countless tribal traditions from the Pacific to the Andes. Could these be fragments of a single ancient memory, a disaster so immense it etched itself into every culture it touched? And if so, was Gunung Padang one of the outposts that endured? The stones themselves seem to encourage this line of thought. In certain spots, if you stand very still, you can feel a faint thrumming through the soles of your feet, as though the earth is humming some wordless hymn. Scientists might speak of micro-seismic activity or the resonance of basalt under strain, but to the villagers, it is the heartbeat of the mountain. Shamans have been known to conduct ceremonies here under a full moon, whispering prayers into the rock, as if the stones might carry their petitions somewhere beyond the stars. The atmosphere is thick with symbolism. In the low terraces, offerings of flowers, incense, and rice are still laid out, the smoke curling upward into the damp night air. Visitors sometimes claim to feel lightheaded, as though the hill itself is bending time, or perhaps bending them to fit its own rhythm. Others have reported dreams after their visit, visions of a stairway that leads not to a summit, but into a sky crowded with constellations no modern astronomer can map. Skeptics will say these are tricks of suggestion, the mind weaving myth into perception. But even they will admit, something about this hill unsettles the easy boundaries between past and present. Its legends refuse to remain as quaint stories. They insist on being read as clues. If King Siliwangi truly stood here, what did he see? And if his palace was never completed, what was it meant to contain or to keep out? In the stillness that follows these questions, the mist creeps in again, softening the sharp edges of stone and memory alike. The terraces become less a structure than a presence, something that has been here longer than the forests, longer than the rivers, perhaps even longer than the people who tell its story. And somewhere beneath that quiet, the first whispers of the mountain linger, waiting for those who will listen closely enough to hear what they have been saying all along. By the early 20th century, Gunung Padang had already lived for untold millennia in silence, disturbed only by the footfalls of villagers bringing offerings or the grazing of goats on its grassy slopes. But in 1914, during the height of Dutch colonial rule in the East Indies, the mountain's quiet was interrupted by a man whose presence would mark the first written acknowledgement of its mystery in modern times. His name was Nicolaas Johannes Kroom, a Dutch historian and archaeologist whose interest in the island's ancient remains had led him deep into Java's rugged interior. Kroom was no fortune seeker. He was a methodical academic, fluent in the language of stone inscriptions and temple ruins. Yet, in the hushed corridors of colonial administration, he had heard whispers. Rumors passed among plantation owners and local guides about strange rock formations high on a remote hill near Cianjur. The stones, they said, were unlike anything else in the region, tall, angular, and arranged in steps like the remnants of an ancient stairway. Armed with maps, a machete, and the patience of a scholar, Kroom climbed the overgrown slope. The forest was thick, the air heavy with humidity, and each step sank slightly into the volcanic soil. When he finally reached the crest, the view that unfolded must have puzzled him as much as it has every visitor since. Rows of massive basalt columns, many toppled and half-buried, but others standing neatly in place as if awaiting an absent builder. The terraces ascended in 5 clear levels, each bordered by carefully aligned stonework that could not easily be explained away as a trick of nature. In his field notes, later summarized in a modest report for the Colonial Archives, Kroom described Gunung Padang as a megalithic site, possibly a prehistoric sanctuary. He noted the striking regularity of the stones, the way some appeared to frame enclosures, and the orientation of certain alignments that hinted at intentional design. But, in the academic language of his time, he downplayed the possibility of extreme antiquity, suggesting instead a relatively recent origin compared to Europe's own monuments. The colonial worldview left little room for the idea that Southeast Asia might harbor structures rivaling or surpassing those of the so-called Old World. And here, the trail begins to blur. Though Kroom's visit was recorded, the details never found their way into the kind of published works that might have drawn global attention. His report seems to have slipped quietly into the filing cabinets of the Netherlands East Indies Archaeological Service. Whether this was due to bureaucratic oversight, lack of interest, or a deliberate choice is difficult to say. Some modern theorists suggest that recognizing Gunung Padang as an advanced prehistoric site would have clashed with the colonial narrative, a narrative that preferred to see local cultures as receivers of influence. not as the originators of monumental engineering. If that is true, then perhaps Crom himself sensed the deeper implications of what he saw. Perhaps he knew that admitting the hill's true complexity would invite questions about who built it, when, and with what knowledge. And those questions might have threatened the intellectual scaffolding of colonial authority. Or perhaps he simply underestimated what lay beneath his feet, seeing only the surface without imagining the layers below. In the years that followed, the site drifted back into obscurity. No excavation teams arrived, no protective measures were taken. The jungle, indifferent to academic politics, resumed its slow work of concealment. Rain eroded the exposed stones, vines curled around their edges, and moss spread like a soft green shroud. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, Gunung Padang had become once again what it had been for centuries, a place of local reverence, invisible to the outside world. And yet, somewhere in a climate-controlled archive, whether in Jakarta, The Hague, or lost entirely, there may still lie a folder containing Crom's original sketches and measurements. If those pages could be found, they might tell us more than just what the site looked like in 1914. They might reveal what he thought, but never dared to write plainly, that this was no natural outcrop, no mere hill, but the weathered crown of something ancient and deliberate, a monument whose true age would challenge the accepted history of civilization. The idea that a discovery could be acknowledged yet quietly buried is not new. In archaeology, as in history, what is omitted can be as telling as what is recorded. And so, between the lines of Crom's sparse notes, a modern reader might hear an unspoken caution, one that has echoed around Gunung Padang ever since. Some truths are best left sleeping until the world is ready to hear them. For decades after Crom's quiet visit, Gunung Padang returned to the slow rhythm of rural life. Seasons came and went. Rice paddies ripened and were harvested in the valleys below, and the terraces above remained hidden beneath mats of grass and creeping vines. To the villagers, the mountain was no secret. Yet, it was not an object of study either. It was simply there, as constant as the clouds that brushed its peak. That changed in 1979. It was planting season, and 3 local farmers, Endi, S, and Abedin, were working along the slope's flanks, tending to their small plots. The day was humid, the air heavy with the scent of wet soil. As they dug, their hoes struck something that did not yield. Expecting stubborn roots or buried tree stumps, they scraped away the dirt and uncovered a smooth, dark edge. More soil came off, revealing a second edge, then a flat surface between them. It was stone. Long, rectangular, and unnervingly regular in shape. A few meters away, they found another, then another, until the outline of an entire step began to emerge. The stones were too large to have been laid by recent hands, and they sat far too deep in the earth to be part of any modern structure. As the farmers worked, the outline expanded upward, revealing yet another tier, and another still. It was as if the hill itself were peeling back to show its bones. Word traveled quickly. Soon, neighbors and relatives came to see the strange steps. Old men nodded knowingly. These were the terraces from the King Siliwangi stories, they said. Some remembered hearing their grandparents speak of a staircase that climbed the mountain like a ladder to the sky. Younger villagers, less given to legend, simply marveled at the size and alignment of the stones. How could they have been moved? And why had they been buried? Local authorities were alerted, and the Indonesian Bureau of Archaeology dispatched a small team to investigate. What they found matched and expanded upon the farmer's discovery. Over 400 basalt columns were mapped, many weighing hundreds of kilograms, arranged across 5 visible terraces. Some terraces stretched for dozens of meters, with retaining walls that still held their shape despite centuries, perhaps millennia, of rain and seismic tremors. In the official records, the site was cautiously dated to between 1,500 and 2,500 years ago, placing it in the Iron Age, a safe, comfortable fit for established timelines. This age range allowed archaeologists to label it a later megalithic site, without provoking debates about Ice Age civilizations. But even then, there were details that refused to sit quietly in the box of accepted history. Some of the terrace alignments appeared to correspond with solstice points. A few stones bore surface marks that seemed too deliberate to be the work of erosion alone. The villagers noticed something else, a change in the air. For generations, they had treated the hill as a place to make offerings, a site where the spirit world was close. Now, with officials measuring and photographing every corner, the energy felt different. Local shamans began holding ceremonies again, as if to remind the mountain that its true purpose was not to be dissected, but honored. Yet for the outside world, the rediscovery barely registered. Indonesia in the late 1970s was focused on rapid development, not on rewriting prehistory. Newspapers mentioned the find briefly, but there was no media frenzy, no surge of funding. Once the survey was complete, the archaeologists moved on to other projects. The terraces remained open to the sky, their newly exposed stones slowly collecting moss. Still, something had shifted. The farmer's unearthing had cracked open a door that could not easily be closed. Visitors began to arrive, first from nearby towns, then from farther afield, drawn by rumors of a stairway older than the temples. Some came to pray, others to take measurements, and a few simply to stand in silence, feeling the basalt beneath their palms. The hill had shown just enough of itself to stir curiosity, but not enough to answer the questions it posed. Who had cut and placed these stones? How many more steps lay buried in the earth? And was this only the visible crown of a far larger structure below? The farmers could not have known it then, but their chance encounter with the first layer of basalt would set in motion a chain of events, scientific, political, and personal, that would pull Gunung Padang out of obscurity and into one of the fiercest archaeological debates of the modern age. And deep within the hill, where light has not reached for thousands of years, the buried steps wait for the day the earth will give them up once more. By the time the archaeologists of the late 20th century had mapped the visible terraces, there was already a sense among some researchers that what lay on the surface was only the prologue. The neatly stacked basalt columns, impressive though they were, felt like an overture to something much larger. The hill itself loomed higher than the exposed stonework, and if the visible terraces were only the crown, what then was the body beneath? It would take decades, and the arrival of more sophisticated technology, for the mountain to begin yielding its deeper secrets. In the early 2000s, new teams brought with them instruments that could see through the soil without disturbing it. Ground-penetrating radar, GPR, send electromagnetic pulses into the earth, mapping density changes. Electrical resistivity tomography measured how easily currents flowed through different layers, revealing voids and denser stonework. Seismic tomography, using controlled vibrations, produced echoes of what lay hidden far below. The results were startling. Beneath the topmost terraces, already old by conventional standards, were deeper, denser layers that seemed to have been deliberately constructed. The surveys identified 3 major phases. The first, visible to the eye, dated somewhere between 1,500 and 3,500 years ago. Beneath it, a second layer appeared at a depth of 3 to 5 meters, compacted and carefully aligned, with radiocarbon samples from organic material placing it roughly 7,500 to 8,300 years old. And then there was the third layer. 15 meters down, the radar and seismic scans revealed a dense matrix of fractured basalt blocks, some forming rectangular voids that looked eerily like chambers. Radiocarbon dating of embedded organic matter suggested an age of 25,000 to 28,000 years, placing its construction in the Upper Paleolithic during the last ice age. According to Orthodox history, this was impossible. Humans of that era in this region were not supposed to be cutting, transporting, and stacking stones by the hundreds of thousands. They were supposed to be painting in caves, shaping crude tools, and living in temporary shelters, not erecting stepped complexes larger than many modern stadiums. Yet, the data refused to vanish. The GPR images showed symmetrical anomalies, lines too straight, corners too sharp, and enclosed spaces too regular to be natural fissures. Some of the voids stretched 10 by 15 meters, with walls aligned to precise angles. Were they burial chambers, storage rooms, or something entirely beyond our modern categories? Resonance halls, astronomical calculators, or even repositories of knowledge meant to outlast cataclysm? The site's geology offered no easy dismissal. Gunung Padang sits atop the hardened heart of an extinct volcano, a natural pedestal that would have given ancient builders both elevation and stability. The basalt columns themselves, hexagonal from the cooling process of volcanic rock, were abundant in the region. But their arrangement here showed human intent. Instead of lying where they formed, they had been transported, rotated, and locked into place like giant puzzle pieces. Adding to the intrigue was a cement-like binder discovered in the deepest layers. Analysis revealed it was not natural sediment, but a deliberate mixture of clay, silica, and iron oxide. Geopolymer chemistry predating Roman concrete by more than 20 millennia. It bonded the stones with a tenacity that had survived earthquakes and tropical rains. Why would a people of the Ice Age need, or know how, to make such a thing? Every measurement raised the stakes. If the dates held true, the third layer of Gunung Padang was older than any pyramid, older than Stonehenge, older even than Göbekli Tepe. The implication was staggering. Somewhere in humanity's deep past, a culture capable of monumental architecture had flourished and then vanished, leaving behind only this buried staircase to nowhere. Of course, not everyone agreed. Skeptics argued that the radiocarbon dates were from organic material that could have filtered down from higher layers over millennia, carried by water or burrowing roots. The structures detected by radar, they said, could be natural fracture patterns in volcanic rock, misinterpreted as chambers by over-enthusiastic researchers. And yet, the images persisted, lines and voids too orderly to be easily dismissed. Even the critics found themselves leaning over the scan prints a little longer than they intended, tracing the outlines of something that, if real, would rewrite the prehistory of Southeast Asia. For the people who lived in the shadow of Gunung Padang, none of this was surprising. The mountain had always been old, older than their stories, older than their language. The farmers who first uncovered the upper terraces in 1979 had only revealed what the earth had chosen to show that year. The rest, they said, was still asleep, and would wake only when it wished to be known. Perhaps that time was drawing near. Perhaps the layers beneath the soil were not just architecture, but messages, built to survive the flood and the fire. If so, then every basalt column was a word, every terrace a sentence, and the whole of Gunung Padang a story carved into the earth itself, waiting for someone to learn how to read it. When the seismic tomography results and deep-layer radiocarbon dates first circulated among Indonesia's archaeological circles, they were met with quiet astonishment. The numbers on the lab reports didn't just stretch the established timeline of Southeast Asian prehistory. They tore it apart. A structure buried 15 meters below the summit of Gunung Padang, built of cut basalt and bound with geopolymer cement, seemed to date back as far as 28,000 years ago. For context, that places its origin not merely before the Egyptian pyramids, or Stonehenge, or even Göbekli Tepe. It puts it in the heart of the last ice age. At that time, the Earth's climate was colder, sea levels were far lower, and vast ice sheets covered much of North America and Europe. According to the textbooks, the people of that age in this part of the world were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They did not farm, they did not forge metal, and they certainly did not engineer megalithic complexes with astronomical alignments. And yet, here was a mountain telling a different story. The claim was spearheaded by Dr. Danny Hilman Natawijaja, a geologist with the Indonesian Institute of Sciences. In measured tones, he presented the evidence: the multiple layers of construction, the composition of the binder material, the straight lines and symmetrical voids deep underground. He did not outright declare that an advanced Ice Age civilization had existed, but the implication hung in the air. If the data is correct, he said, we must reconsider the history of human civilization. International reaction was swift and divided. Alternative history enthusiasts seized upon the findings as vindication for long marginalized theories, linking Gunung Padang to Plato's Atlantis, the lost continent of Mu, or a network of prehistoric maritime cultures that circled the globe. Graham Hancock, author and vocal proponent of a forgotten Ice Age civilization, cited the discovery as further evidence that the human story was far older and more complex than mainstream archaeology admits. Conventional scholars, on the other hand, urged caution. Radiocarbon dating, they argued, measures the age of organic material, not the stone itself. Ancient charcoal found deep underground could have been deposited naturally, or moved downward through cracks and channels. The radar images, they claimed, were open to interpretation. Natural geological formations can mimic artificial structures in subsurface scans. Extraordinary claims, they reminded, require extraordinary evidence. But the debate wasn't just academic, it became political. The idea that Indonesia could host the world's oldest pyramid was both a point of national pride and a lightning rod for controversy. Local media began calling Gunung Padang the proof of a forgotten age. Government officials hinted at increased funding for research, while others privately worried about the cost of full-scale excavation. Adding to the intrigue were whispers, never formally confirmed, of artifacts found in the deeper layers. Fragments of worked metal, smooth stone beads, and objects that did not match known prehistoric tool types. If true, such finds could tip the scale decisively toward human construction. But official reports on these items, if they exist, have yet to surface. Meanwhile, villagers reported an uptick in visitors, both scientists and seekers, climbing the terraces with cameras, pendulums, or prayer beads. Some claim to feel energy lines running through the site. others to have dreams after touching the basalt columns. A few even suggested that the site was intentionally buried to protect it from a coming cataclysm, much like the biblical account of Noah building the ark to survive the flood. The possibility of a 28,000-year-old monument forces a cascade of questions. Who built it? Where did they get the knowledge to quarry, transport, and arrange thousands of tons of stone? And if such a civilization existed, what happened to it? Was it destroyed in the rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, remembered only in myths of drowned kingdoms and divine punishment? For now, the 28,000-year claim exists in a liminal space, supported by compelling but contested evidence, embraced by some, dismissed by others, and unanswered by all. The stones remain silent, holding their secrets in the cool darkness beneath the soil. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth. In the shadow of Gunung Padang, our certainty about the past feels less like a fact and more like an assumption, one the earth itself may one day overturn. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Gunung Padang might break into the mainstream historical narrative, forcing museums, textbooks, and university lectures to reframe the human timeline. But almost as quickly as the headlines about a 28,000-year-old pyramid appeared, they began to retract. The shift was subtle at first. Small edits to online articles, softened language in academic summaries, a quiet removal of the most provocative claims from official announcements. Then came the public rebuttals. Several archaeologists, both Indonesian and international, began publishing critiques of the dating methods, emphasizing that radiocarbon tests measure organic material, not stone, and that such samples could be contaminated by later activity. Some dismissed the deeper layers as natural geological formations shaped by the cooling of volcanic lava into columnar joints. Others accused proponents of sensationalism, suggesting they were courting media attention at the expense of scientific rigor. Dr. Danny Hillman Natawijaja, once cautiously optimistic in his presentations, now found himself in the crosshairs of academic politics. Interviews that once welcomed his findings began to frame him as controversial. Funding for continued deep excavations slowed, redirected toward less speculative projects. Conference invitations dried up, replaced with polite but firm statements that his conclusions were not in alignment with the consensus view. To some, this was a normal and necessary correction, science policing its own boundaries. To others, it felt like a coordinated effort to put the genie back in the bottle. Alternative historians and independent researchers noted how similar patterns had played out before. Discoveries that threatened established chronologies often faced not only scholarly skepticism, but institutional pressure to conform. Whether this was simply the self-correcting nature of science or something more deliberate was itself a matter of debate. And then there were the rumors. Whispers circulated among fringe researchers that certain data from the original surveys, particularly high-resolution scans of the deepest anomalies, had been quietly archived and locked away. There were stories, unverifiable but persistent, about finds that had never been publicly cataloged. Shaped stone tools from beneath the upper terraces, fragments of ceramics where no pottery was supposed to exist, and a piece of metal, too refined for the supposed age, whose presence in a 28,000-year-old context would be impossible to explain under orthodox history. Official statements brushed these aside, but the retraction storm had a paradoxical effect. While it may have muted the story in mainstream channels, it electrified alternative history communities. Online forums lit up with speculation. YouTube channels devoted to ancient mysteries began releasing hour-long videos dissecting satellite images, early excavation photos, and even translations of old Dutch colonial records in search of overlooked clues. Locally, the tension was palpable. Villagers who had once been proud to tell tourists about their ancient pyramid began to hedge their words, unsure whether to repeat claims that were now labeled as controversial. Guides were advised to stick to officially approved narratives. Gunung Padang as a late megalithic site, built within the last few thousand years. But under the surface, belief in its far greater antiquity persisted. And here is where the question grows larger than the site itself. How much of history is shaped by what we find, and how much by what we are allowed to say about it? The retraction storm over Gunung Padang revealed more than just a disagreement over dating methods. It exposed the fragile balance between evidence, interpretation, and the structures of authority that decide which interpretations survive. Even as the official stance shifted toward caution, the hill remained unchanged. The terraces still caught the sunrise. The stones still hummed faintly in the heat of the day. The deep layers, whether they held chambers, voids, or nothing but fractured rock, still waited, untouched. And for those who had once glimpsed the possibility of an Ice Age civilization standing here, the storm of retractions was less a silencing than a challenge. Proof, perhaps, that the truth, whatever it is, still lies buried, not just under the soil, but under the weight of the narratives we've chosen to believe. The moment the 28,000-year figure hit the public imagination, another current began to swirl beneath the archaeological debates, one less concerned with radiocarbon half-lives and more with the myths that seemed to echo across the planet. For some, Gunung Padang was not just an isolated enigma. It was a possible keystone in the long, fractured legend of lost civilizations. The first and loudest parallel was Atlantis, Plato's enduring tale of a great island kingdom beyond the Pillars of Hercules, blessed with advanced technology, swallowed by the sea in a single cataclysm, has been retold for over 2 millennia. The mainstream view holds that Atlantis was an allegory, a philosophical device rather than a historical memory. But for those who take it literally, the resemblance to the Gunung Padang story was tantalizing. A monumental site advanced beyond its time, possibly destroyed or buried by a great flood. Others drew connections to Mu, the supposed lost continent of the Pacific popularized in the early 20th century by James Churchward. According to his writings, based on what he claimed were ancient records from India, Mu was a vast, sophisticated civilization that spanned much of the Pacific basin, its knowledge radiating to the Americas and Asia. When Mu sank beneath the ocean, its survivors scattered, seeding the monumental traditions of places like Easter Island, Central America, and Southeast Asia. If such a migration happened, Java would have been a natural waypoint, and Gunung Padang could be one of its final standing outposts. Then there is Sundaland, the vast Ice Age landmass that once connected much of what is now Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, before being swallowed by rising seas around 11,600 years ago. In the view of some geologists, Sundaland's drowning was one of the greatest coastal floods in human history. In the eyes of speculative historians, it was a perfect match for the great flood myths found from Mesopotamia to Polynesia. If a civilization had flourished there, its surviving highland structures would now appear as lonely hilltop monuments. just like Gunung Padang. To most academics, such parallels are coincidence or mythologized memory. But to the alternative history community, they are breadcrumbs, scattered fragments of a once global network. The basalt terraces of Gunung Padang, they argue, could have been a ceremonial or astronomical hub, linked to other sites along ancient trade or migration routes. The fact that megalithic construction appears in widely separated parts of the world, often using similar techniques of massive stone blocks and precise alignments, only fuels the suspicion of a shared origin. Local folklore deepens the intrigue. Among the Sundanese, stories persist of a great king who ruled a vast territory, of a time of water when only the high places survived, and of sacred sites built to preserve knowledge from a forgotten age. These tales are told in tones of reverence, not speculation, as if they are not just legends, but inherited memories. In the cool evenings when mist gathers on the terraces, one can almost believe that such memories are embedded in the stones themselves. The question, of course, is whether any of this can be proven, or if the very nature of such catastrophes ensures that proof is always just out of reach. If Gunung Padang is truly connected to Atlantis, Mu, or Sundaland, the link might lie in patterns, shared symbols carved into stone, alignments pointing to the same stars, or construction methods too similar to be coincidence. And if those patterns exist, they may be buried as deeply as the oldest layers of the hill. For now, the connection remains speculative. But speculation has its own power. It draws the curious to climb the terraces, to stand where the wind from the Java Sea brushes against ancient stone, and to wonder if they are touching not just a local mystery, but the last surviving fragment of a world that once was. And somewhere between the lines of Plato's dialogues, the chants of Polynesian navigators, and the quiet stories of Sundanese elders, the same unspoken question emerges. What if the flood did not just erase cities? It erased the memory that they ever existed. Not long after Gunung Padang's deeper layers became a subject of international speculation, a different kind of visitor began appearing on its terraces. Not archaeologists with measuring tapes, nor journalists with cameras, but people carrying copper rods, pendulums, tuning forks, and other tools that seemed more at home in a metaphysics shop than a research site. They called themselves energy hunters. Some were engineers turned spiritual researchers, others lifelong practitioners of geomancy, dowsing, or meditation. To them, the hill was more than just a megalithic site. It was a living instrument, a point where the Earth's energy lines, or ley lines, converged. The first hints of this came from simple observation. On certain days, usually near dawn or dusk, visitors claimed to feel subtle vibrations through the soles of their feet when standing on specific basalt columns. Compass needles spun or trembled in some spots, as though magnetic fields were being disturbed. Sensitive microphones placed against the stones recorded faint, low-frequency hums, not loud enough to be heard by the ear, but detectable in the waveforms of the recordings. These anomalies, to a geophysicist, could have explanations. Natural piezoelectric effects from quartz-bearing rock under pressure, or temperature-driven expansion and contraction of the stone. But to the energy hunters, they were signs that Gunung Padang had been intentionally designed to harness and focus natural forces, earth energies, cosmic resonance, or both. They pointed to the shape and placement of the terraces. From above, the layout appeared to funnel movement upward in a spiral-like progression, a path that could symbolically or literally tune the person climbing it. Some suggested that the basalt columns themselves, arranged in deliberate orientations, could amplify vibrational frequencies, much like the pipes of a massive organ. And then there were the alignments. Certain sight lines between stones and horizon points matched not only solar events, but also the rising and setting of particular stars. A small but persistent group of researchers proposed that such features hinted at a forgotten science, an ancient geotechnology that blended architecture, astronomy, and acoustics. They compared Gunung Padang to other enigmatic sites: the singing stones of ancient Malta, the resonant chambers of the Great Pyramid, and the precisely tuned walls of Chavín de Huántar in Peru. In each case, the stonework seemed to interact with sound and vibration in ways that modern architects rarely replicate. Of course, these ideas only deepened the divide between mainstream and fringe interpretations. Critics dismissed the energy claims as pseudoscience, warning that confirmation bias could make people feel what they expected to feel. But others argued that such dismissals ignored the fact that ancient builders often chose materials and shapes with acoustic or magnetic properties, whether for ritual, communication, or other purposes now forgotten. For the villagers, the energy talk wasn't strange at all. They had long believed the mountain was a place of heightened spiritual power. Weddings, healing rituals, and prayer ceremonies had been held on its terraces for generations. Elders told of moments when offerings placed on certain stones would shift slightly on their own, as if moved by an unseen hand. Whether these were the result of subtle tremors, air currents, or something less tangible, no one could say. Today, some of these energy hunters still visit quietly, avoiding the official tours and climbing in the cool hours when the site is nearly empty. They set their instruments on the basalt, close their eyes, and listen. Not just for sound, but for the sensation that perhaps the stones are listening back. And if Gunung Padang truly holds some ancient, engineered energy, then perhaps the reason for its burial wasn't collapse or abandonment at all. Perhaps it was put to sleep, covered deliberately to silence its resonance, until a time when the world would again understand how to read and how to use the frequencies locked in its stone. By the mid-2010s, Gunung Padang was no longer a quiet archaeological curiosity. It had become a battlefield, though not one fought with weapons, but with reports, press conferences, and strategic silences. On one side were those pushing for full-scale excavation, convinced that the hill concealed a structure of global historical importance. On the other were the defenders of orthodoxy, warning against what they saw as reckless destruction of both heritage and scientific credibility. The excavation advocates argued that the technology was now in place to uncover the deeper layers without guesswork. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, and careful layer-by-layer removal could reveal what lay beneath with minimal disturbance. If the deeper chambers truly existed, and if artifacts or inscriptions were found inside, it could transform our understanding of human prehistory. Indonesia, they argued, could stand at the center of a rewritten world timeline. For a brief moment, political will seemed to align with ambition. In 2014, under President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, there was public support for expanding research. A presidential task force was even formed to investigate Gunung Padang, and the media buzzed with talk of the world's oldest pyramid being on Javanese soil. Dr. Danny Hillman Natawidjaja and his team seemed poised to get the green light for deeper digs. But the optimism didn't last. After the change in government, priorities shifted. Funding was cut back. Permits for expanded excavations stalled. Official statements began to downplay the more provocative findings, leaning on the safer, late Megalithic label. Critics of the 28,000-year dating pushed harder, accusing the pro-excavation camp of sensationalism and even of threatening the site's preservation for the sake of publicity. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere grew tense. There were reports, never officially confirmed, of researchers being quietly pressured to withdraw from the project or to reframe their conclusions to better fit the consensus. Some local officials, worried about the cultural and spiritual importance of the site, sided with caution. Others feared that without decisive action, the opportunity to make a historic discovery would be lost. Even the villagers found themselves drawn into the conflict. For some, a full excavation promised jobs, tourism income, and a place in history. For others, the idea of tearing into the hill felt like a violation, disturbing a sacred place that had watched over them for generations. Elders warned that uncovering what lay beneath could awaken forces better left alone. The argument wasn't just about science. It was about ownership. Who had the right to decide the fate of a site like Gunung Padang? The local community? The national government? International archaeologists? Or was the mountain, in some way, its own guardian, revealing only what it chose to reveal? In the absence of official progress, a kind of stalemate took hold. The visible terraces remained accessible to tourists, their basalt columns slowly wearing under countless footsteps. The deeper layers, if they existed as described, stayed hidden. Papers were published, countered, and debated, but the ground itself remained closed. And so the battle for excavation became a battle of narratives. Each camp waited for the other to falter, for new evidence to emerge, or for political winds to shift once again. In the meantime, Gunung Padang stood silent above the surrounding hills, its summit catching the first light of dawn, its base anchored in shadows that no trowel or drill had yet touched. To those who climbed it, the hill seemed to hold its breath. Whether it was guarding an ancient tomb, a forgotten library of stone, or simply layers of geological coincidence, it had already taught one lesson. Sometimes the fiercest battles in archaeology aren't fought with picks and shovels, but with the power to decide that when, and if, the earth should give up its secrets. To view Gunung Padang in isolation is to miss the larger riddle it seems to whisper about. For if the basalt terraces of Java are truly as ancient as some claim, then they join a much bigger and stranger family of monuments scattered across the world, each one hinting at a forgotten chapter of human history. From the windswept plains of Turkey rises Göbekli Tepe, a ring of massive T-shaped pillars carved with animals and abstract symbols, dated to around 11,600 years ago. Already older than agriculture, rewriting the sequence of first came farming, then came temples. Far to the west, the pyramids of Egypt stand in stark precision against the desert sky, their astronomical alignments echoing a mind that saw both the earth and the heavens as parts of a single, measurable whole. Across the ocean in Peru, Sacsayhuaman's colossal stone walls lock together with such impossible tightness that not even a razor blade can pass between the blocks. In Japan, divers have explored the submerged Yonaguni Monument, a series of step-like terraces, platforms, and geometric shapes that some insist are man-made, though the sea has kept its secrets for thousands of years. Off the coast of India, the drowned city of Dwarka has yielded structures and artifacts beneath the waves, tied to both archaeology and Hindu epic tradition. Even on the far-off Easter Island, the massive Moai statues gaze inland as if guarding something, reminders of a civilization whose true origins are still debated. The question, whispered in every one of these places, is whether they are connected, not just by trade or cultural diffusion, but by something deeper. Could they be the scattered remnants of an older, more global civilization that existed before the great floods at the end of the Ice Age? One that shared a common language of stone, sky, and sacred geometry? Gunung Padang's defenders see it as one of the missing pieces in this puzzle. Its terraced design, astronomical hints, and possible Ice Age origin fit neatly into a pattern that refuses to be dismissed as coincidence. They point out that many megalithic sites around the world display the same obsessions, with cardinal directions, with solstices and equinoxes, with certain constellations. They ask whether such alignments, found independently across continents, could be the fingerprints of a shared ancestral knowledge. Skeptics counter that humans everywhere have always observed the stars, and that stone is the most enduring material for monuments. Similar designs could emerge independently. But this argument falters when one considers the precision, scale, and sometimes inexplicable engineering found in these sites. How did Ice Age or early post-Ice Age cultures move and shape stones weighing tens or hundreds of tons? Why do so many megaliths defy simple utilitarian explanations, leaning instead toward ceremonial, astronomical, or even energetic purposes? Then, there are the myths. Remarkably similar flood narratives found from Mesopotamia to Polynesia, from the Bible's Genesis to the Mayan Popol Vuh. Many describe gods or demigods who survive a cataclysm, then teach humanity the arts of civilization: farming, building, astronomy. In some traditions, these teachers are said to have emerged from the sea or from the mountains, just as Gunung Padang rises high above the drowned plains of ancient Sundaland. It is tempting to think of the Earth's megaliths as points on an ancient map, a constellation drawn not in stars, but in stone. Perhaps they were outposts, aligned not just geographically, but functionally, calibrated to harness energy, track the heavens, or encode messages meant to survive the collapse of their world. If that is so, then Gunung Padang is not just a local mystery. It is a fragment of a far larger story, one whose missing pages may still lie beneath the soil, beneath the waves, and perhaps beneath our willingness to believe that the past is stranger and older than we have yet imagined. In academic circles, there is an unspoken boundary, a line between what can be questioned and what must remain unshaken. Step too far across it, and a researcher risks more than just peer criticism. They risk becoming a ghost in their own profession. For many, Gunung Padang has become one of those lines. The term forbidden archaeology is controversial. To mainstream scholars, it's a phrase hijacked by conspiracy theorists to suggest that inconvenient discoveries are deliberately hidden. Yet history offers more than a few examples where certain finds were quietly shelved, not because they were proven false, but because they were too disruptive to fit the model. Whispers in archaeological backrooms tell of stone tools found in geological layers millions of years old, of human remains that predate Homo sapiens by tens of thousands of years, of artifacts with levels of precision suggesting machines in eras when the wheel supposedly didn't exist. Officially, such anomalies are dismissed as errors in dating, contamination, or misinterpretation. But what if some of them are genuine? And what if Gunung Padang belongs to that forbidden category? Dr. Denny Hillman's 28,000-year dating alone places it in dangerous territory. accept it without qualification. And you must also accept that our species, or another advanced culture, was capable of monumental construction during the Ice Age. That would dismantle the long-accepted sequence of human development. Hunter-gatherers, farmers, city builders. If civilization's roots run that deep, then much of the archaeological record becomes a palimpsest. History written over older history, with the earliest chapters erased. The political dimension complicates things further. In many countries, heritage sites are tied to national identity. Admitting that an ancient monument predates the accepted cultural lineage can be seen as threatening that identity. And then there is the economic factor. Entire industries, from textbook publishing to tourism marketing, are built upon the timelines we think we know. A discovery like Gunung Padang, if validated, could force a rewrite on a global scale. For those in the forbidden archaeology camp, such stakes explain why certain evidence disappears from public view. They point to excavation photographs no longer in archives, GPR scans missing from final reports, and objects rumored to have been removed before official cataloging. Some even speculate that international agencies, ostensibly interested in heritage preservation, play a role in steering narratives towards safer ground. It's worth noting that secrecy is not always sinister. Some sites are protected from disclosure to prevent looting or vandalism. Some finds remain unpublished simply because there is not yet enough funding or staff to study them. But for the public, the effect is the same. A gap in the record, a sense that pieces of the puzzle are being withheld. And that gap invites speculation, sometimes wild, sometimes chilling. Could Gunung Padang be a repository of ancient knowledge, hidden to protect it from misuse? Could it hold evidence that another branch of humanity, or a non-human intelligence, walked the earth before the civilizations we know? Could its terraces and buried chambers be the remnants of a culture that understood energy, astronomy, and engineering in ways we have yet to rediscover? In the absence of transparency, these questions take root. The story of Gunung Padang is no longer just about dating techniques or stone arrangements. It's about the politics of knowledge itself. Who decides what the public can know about the deep past? And if the truth threatens the foundations of our history, will it ever be allowed to surface? For now, the hill waits. Whether it is an anomaly to be explained away or a crack in the facade of the historical timeline, its stones are patient. They have already outlasted empires, faiths, and entire epochs. Perhaps they can wait a little longer, until someone is willing to follow the evidence, no matter where it leads, no matter what it overturns. Long before the first ground-penetrating radar scans, before the debates over radiocarbon dates, Gunung Padang lived in the language of prophecy. In the villages surrounding the hill, elders spoke of it not as an archaeological site, but as a sleeping sentinel, a place built not merely for the past, but for a future moment when its purpose would be revealed. The oldest tales, told in low voices during the long rainy nights, describe the hill as the throne of the great king, a ruler who reigned during an age before the world was washed clean. This king, it was said, commanded not just armies, but the forces of the earth itself. His people raised stone upon stone in patterns that would outlast memory, inscribing into the landscape a code that could only be read when humanity was ready again. In some versions, the king foresaw a coming flood, not just of water, but of forgetting. Knowledge would be scattered like seeds in the wind. The terraces of Gunung Padang, according to the legend, were both monument and message, a structure that could hold the vibration of truth through the silence of millennia. Certain elements of the prophecy are strangely specific. Some elders speak of 3 doors hidden beneath the hill, doors that must be opened in a particular sequence. Others insist that the hill will only yield its secret when the stars stand as they once stood. A cryptic reference that has led modern researchers to check for possible astronomical alignments. A few go further, claiming that when the chambers are opened, a sound like the voice of the earth will be heard across the valley. It is tempting to dismiss these stories as cultural poetry, mythic language meant to keep younger generations respectful of sacred ground. But every so often, an odd coincidence blurs the line. In one telling, the 3 doors are described as lying under layers like the skins of an onion. When seismic tomography was conducted, it revealed 3 distinct subterranean layers beneath the terraces, each with anomalies that could be interpreted as voids or chambers. The prophecy also warns of danger. The knowledge stored in the hill, it says, is not meant for every age. Opened too soon, it could bring fire instead of light. To some, this reads like a warning about advanced technology, something powerful, perhaps dangerous, preserved from a forgotten civilization. To others, it is metaphorical, wisdom that could be misused by a world not yet ready to wield it. What makes these legends even more intriguing is how they echo myths from far beyond Java. In the Hopi traditions of North America, sacred caves are said to hold the records of the previous worlds, sealed until the right time. In the Tibetan Bon tradition, Terma treasures are hidden by enlightened beings to be discovered when humanity most needs them. Even in the Bible, the Ark of the Covenant is concealed until the appointed hour. Could Gunung Padang be another expression of the same ancient instinct to hide and guard what must survive catastrophe? For the people who live in the shadow of the hill, such questions are not academic. Some actively oppose further excavation, fearing that prophecy is not to be rushed. Others believe the moment is approaching, that the hill has remained silent long enough, and that the modern world, teetering between collapse and awakening, may be the very age for which it was built. Whether the prophecy is a coded memory from an Ice Age culture or a story woven purely from faith, it ensures one thing. Gunung Padang is not just a pile of stones to be measured and dated. It is a living presence in the landscape, carrying the weight of promises made thousands of years ago, promises that may yet demand to be fulfilled. Every great archaeological discovery carries 2 possible fates. One is revelation, the unveiling of knowledge that expands our understanding of who we are and where we come from. The other is ruin, the irreversible damage that can occur when we rush to uncover something we do not yet understand. Gunung Padang stands precisely on that razor's edge. If the hill truly hides a structure from 28,000 years ago, it could redefine the origins of civilization itself. Humanity's narrative would stretch far deeper into the Ice Age, challenging the idea that complex societies emerged only after agriculture. Such a revelation would not be a mere footnote. It would shatter the foundations of multiple disciplines, forcing archaeology, anthropology, and even theology to rethink the flow of human history. Yet the danger is equally profound. Once excavation begins in earnest, there is no way to return the site to its untouched state. If the deeper layers are mishandled, if priceless artifacts are exposed to the elements too soon, if structural collapses occur, if local spiritual taboos are ignored, then whatever message Gunung Padang carries could be lost forever. Worse still, it could be desecrated in the name of progress. There is also the question of what might be revealed. If the prophecy holds any truth, if the chambers beneath the hill contain not just relics, but something of immense power or significance, then the world would not meet it in unity. Competing governments, private collectors, and corporations would rush to claim ownership. The site could become a geopolitical flashpoint, its meaning buried again under layers of secrecy and control. This tension between discovery and destruction is not unique to Gunung Padang. The tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, has never been opened because of fears that the advanced mercury-based preservation inside could be destroyed the moment it is exposed. In Egypt, some burial chambers remain sealed for similar reasons. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls were once locked away in a kind of academic limbo, accessible to only a select few for decades. The question is whether restraint can win against curiosity. Modern history suggests it rarely does. If Gunung Padang does contain an unprecedented key to the past, someone, somewhere, will eventually push to open it. The only uncertainty is whether the opening will be done with reverence and transparency, or with haste and hidden agendas. For now, the hill is both patient and indifferent. It has already waded through the rise and fall of empires, through floods and droughts, through eras when its terraces were tended and others when they were left to the vines. It will wait through our debates as well, perhaps knowing that the real choice lies not in if it will be opened, but how. And in that, Gunung Padang holds up a mirror to humanity. The stones ask us a question without words. Are we a species ready to receive the deepest truths of our past? Or will we, as before, turn revelation into ruin? Evening settles over the highlands, and the air on Gunung Padang grows cool. The last tourists have descended the stone steps, their voices fading into the distance until only the sounds of wind and cicadas remain. Shadows gather between the basalt columns, and the terraces seem to dissolve into the night. It is here, in this quiet, that the hill feels most alive. Without the distraction of chatter or the click of cameras, the stones seem to breathe. The scent of damp earth rises from the grass. Somewhere, a night bird calls, its echo carrying down into the valleys. Above, the first stars emerge, glittering in the same constellations that have shone over this place for tens of thousands of years. From the summit, the land stretches in all directions, a patchwork of rice paddies and forest, mist curling in the lowlands like slow rivers of cloud. It is easy to imagine what this view might have been long before villages, long before roads, when the terraces stood as part of something greater, perhaps even the heart of a forgotten world. The debates, the politics, the arguments over dating and ownership, they belong to the daylight. In the hush of night, the questions take on a different shape. They are no longer about proving or disproving theories, but about listening. What if the hill is not waiting to be explained, but waiting for us to hear? Maybe the real mystery of Gunung Padang is not the age of its stones or the depth of its buried chambers, but the way it seems to call across time. To climb it is to join an unbroken chain of human footsteps, stretching back into prehistory, feet that stood where you stand now, looking out over the same horizon, wondering the same unanswerable questions. The stories say the hill guards a message. Perhaps that message is not meant to be read in a chamber beneath the earth, but in the patience of the stones themselves. They remind us that civilizations rise and fall, that oceans advance and retreat, that what is lost may not be gone forever. only waiting for its moment to return. Some will keep searching for proof, digging deeper in both soil and theory. Others will leave it as it is, content to let the hill remain wrapped in mystery. Both paths, in their own way, are part of the same journey, a journey into the unknown, where every answer only leads to more questions. As the night deepens, the wind picks up, whispering through the grass at your feet. You can't tell if it's just the breeze or if the stones are speaking. Either way, you find yourself listening, as countless others have, for something you cannot quite name. And somewhere in that stillness, you realize perhaps the truth of Gunung Padang is not to be solved, but to be felt. A reminder that the greatest mysteries are not in the past. They are alive, here and now, in the spaces between what we know and what we dare to imagine. The stars turn slowly overhead. The hill sleeps on. The mystery remains.